So welcome everybody to the next edition of Transportation Insights. Today we're so lucky to have Pierre Garreau with us today. Welcome, Pierre.
Hi, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So today we're going to speak about building greener supply chains. So Pierre, can you make a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on this transportation series. It's really good to be here. So my name is Pierre. I'm the co-founder at SeaRoutes. We're a company that's established in Marseille and Hamburg, and the whole premise of the company is to help make supply chain greener. So the topic is right on spot for us. So the company is about 18 months old now. Got a pretty nice small team, but mainly R&D engineers with PhD backgrounds like myself. Yeah, and I'm really excited to tell you all about what we do.
Excellent. So approximately 8% of global CO2 emissions come from transportation of goods today. So when we speak to customers, we've seen a bit of a change in terms of how they think about their CO2 footprint. Can you tell me a bit about your vision with SeaRoutes?
Yeah, it's amazing that you're starting with this number. Actually, depending on what report you're looking at, so the European Union has put a couple of studies on this, and one study that's striking is that number 8%, which is already really high, could go up to 1/3 of all CO2 emissions coming from transport in 2050. So it's a huge number, and this is in the case where nobody does anything. The European Union doesn't put any pressure, or there's no regulation. Shippers are not taking any actions. Carriers are not doing anything. And so that's why you're seeing initiatives like the Green Deal, for instance, where the European Union is trying to reduce these emissions by 90% by 2030, so that we don't get that figure of 1/3 of all CO2 emissions coming from transport. Yeah, that's huge. And so obviously this is pushing companies, in particular shippers, to come up with tactics to reduce their CO2 emissions. And so not just CO2, but greenhouse gases in general. And so the real question is, what can shippers do? What are the tactics? And so before I even address that question, I think there is another thing that's interesting to look at. On one side, there is the regulatory pressure, so the legal is definitely pushing. But on the other side, you have the consumers. Consumers of big shippers, from sporting companies, from furnishing companies. They're also pressuring these consumers to buy green today. They want a pair of sneakers that is zero emissions. They want to buy tables that are made of recycled woods and also have no impact on climate. And so shippers really have these two pressure points: the consumers on one side and the legal on one side. And these two pressure points are going in the same direction, which is right. So the next question is, what can they do about it now? So I can tell you what we would like them to do. So at SeaRoutes, basically, yeah, go ahead.
So companies that we work with, some of them, they also make very bold statements in terms of what they plan to do publicly. So some of them, they go out and they say, our ambition is to reduce emission with, for example, 25% by 2025. And then obviously when it comes to ocean freight and air freight, they also discussing, so how could they make decisions to choose certain providers that will enable them to reach these goals. From your perspective, how would it be possible to get data to support those decisions, and then over time to track the impact of the decisions? Is that possible today, and what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think you're putting the finger exactly where it hurts. So giving your clients the possibility to choose or to see which service would reduce their CO2 footprint is definitely the right direction for them to reduce CO2 coming from transport. There are several steps to this. The first step is they need to measure this correctly. That means at the end of a quarter or right when they just did a booking, look at exactly what the CO2 was that was emitted during that particular transport. So the first thing is measure accurately. And currently the different sources of data that you can get out there from different providers don't allow you to measure this accurately at the right level. And the key here is to be able to differentiate a service from a carrier. So two different services between a port pair from a given carrier, or to differentiate services across carriers. That's the end goal. So what data source you're asking do you need to be able to do that? Well, the essential one is maybe we can do a little reminder or refresher for everybody on CO2, but how does one measure CO2 that's coming from, let's say, sea freight? You need a port pair, right? So you're transporting containers on a vessel between two ports. There are several factors, but the number one factor is what's the distance sailed by a particular vessel between that port pair. So in there, obviously vessels do different rotations. They have different stops en route. So some of them have express services. And so distances vary considerably. And obviously the longer the distance, the more you're sailing, the more CO2 you emit. So distance is number one. The second is the speed at which you travel. So you need to look into, is your vessel transporting your containers traveling fast, or is it traveling slow? Yeah, that's basically the number two. And obviously the size of the vessel will matter. And then there's a lot of other factors that come into play. If you have weather en route, what's the state of your vessel? Is it reefer plugs, or are you carrying dry stuff? So there's lots of other things, but the main three ingredients are the real distance, the vessel speed, and obviously which vessel. So that's the data points you need to measure CO2 accurately.
But isn't the ocean kayak carriers, aren't they able to do this today themselves? And so why would anyone need a different company to measure these things?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the different carriers have put in place an initiative called the Clean Cargo Working Group, which is a great initiative. And the idea is to put in place a standard so that everybody reports on CO2 in the same way. And so it's a great initiative. The problem with this is that what's being reported is an aggregated value per trade lane, per carrier. So what you see is kind of a yearly aggregate of all the fuel consumption or CO2 emissions, and then how much they've sailed on that trade lane. So then this includes all the vessels on all the port pairs on a given trade lane, and so you don't have that information. So if you want service level CO2 emissions, carriers would need to be able to report accurately on the service level, even better on the vessel level between the port pair. And that becomes a difficult exercise. First, they have that information, they could put it out there. We just need to put in systems in place to be able to retrieve this from their systems accurately. So there's a little bit of software that needs to be built on this, but let's leave this aside. The second thing is, if they put that data available for everybody to see, then I have information about how much fuel has a vessel of a particular fleet of a particular carrier consumed between a port pair. And that's sensitive information because it carries the information of pricing in there. And so I don't think we're going to see the carriers give that granularity of data anytime soon.
Right. Interesting. But if you look into the crystal ball, how does this market look like in 5 to 10 years? Is there any changes happening? Not only from the ones buying and selling freight, but also from regulatory authorities on this topic.
Yeah, so I have one which I would really like to see happening, And it's going to be really easy to understand for shippers in particular when we make the analogy with schedules. Today, shippers, freight forwarders, but shippers make decisions to choose a service based on transit time. And so obviously they need goods A to B shipped in a given amount of time under price constraints, but they're very sensitive to this transit time question. And one thing that we saw happening is we saw a few companies starting to rate the carriers based on can they meet their announced transit time. And so you see things like a reliability index of the transit time. So, you know, one of the carriers will say we do New York, Shanghai in X amount of days, and they're on spot 95% of the time. That's a really good company. So a shipper knows if I book that service, my goods will arrive on time. And so that's really good. What I think you'll see happening is the same thing with GHG emissions. So what you'll see is you'll have someone, maybe SeaRoutes, computing an a priori CO2 value. So this service should emit X amount of CO2. So this is the announced value. And then a posteriori, because we have all these data points nowadays, we know where the vessel sails, we know what speed, we know the exact loop, and so forth. We can measure the posteriori value. And we can actually compare, was the promise made by the carrier met? And how reliable is it? And you can do this across carriers. And the same thing we're doing for reliability of transit time, you'll see on CO2 as well. And therefore, the big shippers that have CO2 targets and want to take actions to meet these, they'll have a tendency to go with carriers that are reliable in terms of CO2 emissions as well. And so I think this is a really interesting direction where things will naturally evolve, and probably the carbon accounting mechanisms that we saw the European Union is putting in place with carbon quotas will probably go in that direction.
That's encouraging and exciting, and I think for the ones buying freight and also the ones selling freight in the future to have transparency on emission, on reliability, and on price will potentially also help them to compete, not only about the pricing but also on the qualitative aspect of the service. So, any final words you'd like to say before we end today?
Yeah, Thomas, I'm really excited about the topic. I can only say it's exciting because it's a new topic. You see people moving really fast on the regulatory side, on the client side, the shippers and companies like SeaRoutes that are trying to bring this transparency. So I'm only excited. There's no other word to see how this evolves and how we can use this really to make better decisions.
Fantastic. So Pierre, thanks a lot for spending time with us today. We'll definitely look further into how we potentially also could get access to some of the data that you have, because I know that there's quite a bit of interest from the shipper community when it comes to these things. So let's keep in touch on that. And I also would like to remind everybody of our customers that we have our customer summit coming up 14th and 15th of October. So register. You'll find the link on our website, and we hope to see as many as possible during these 2 days. So thanks again, Pierre, for taking the time with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Thomas.
Perfect. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.